Hello and welcome to episode 34 of the Wilder podcast. In this episode, we chat to our very own tiny home guru, Simon Whitfield, where we cover all of the key ingredients needed to create yourself your very own off-grid escape, as well as exploring the more philosophical side of a tiny living lifestyle. Chloe, hello.
Hello, Tom.
Listeners, now, I'm pretty sure for the last 5 episodes, we start with an apology, which, as everyone says, don't ever start a presentation with an apology. We're starting a podcast with an apology. Happy New Year. Merry Christmas to everybody here.
Sorry, we're a bit late.
So it's the 17th of January recording this, so it's a little bit late. But
And in the last podcast, we suggested we might get another one out before Christmas. So anyway, never mind.
yeah, my excuse for my homework being late, dear listener, is that we got around to editing the amazing interview that's coming up, and it is amazing and wonderful and well worth the wait. However, I may take responsibility for this slightly. Oh, I think I've got PTSD from that noise. We recorded this interview, and as you do interviews and as you get a number of episodes into a podcast, you start to get a really warm, fuzzy feeling when you're having a great interview. And this was that warm, fuzzy feeling with Simon. When we finished, we were like, that's great. That's going to be one of our best interviews. And I come around to editing it, and unfortunately, my phone was on silent, but the recording software, for some reason, picked up my phone ringing. Don't know why or how. And not only once, but the person that was trying to get hold of me rang for 10 minutes straight.
He was really persistent.
Halfway through this amazing recording. So Simon very kindly came back and re-recorded a chunk of it, and you wouldn't even notice it. And there's a wonderful editing effort that's gone on to make it sound seamless.
And I think only Si could come in from essentially doing some maintenance work to one of our lovely cabins and orate this wonderful chunk of interview and then slip right back out there again.
Yeah. But if you are new to the podcast and you just heard us for the last 2 minutes explain why things have gone wrong, Chloe, would you like to explain who we are and what we're doing and why you might want to be listening to the Wilder podcast?
Those are 3 big questions, but I'm going to give them a go. So we are Chloe and Tom. We are a husband and wife, and we are busy rewilding our 80 acres in rural Monmouthshire. But alongside that, we are also documenting our journey through the Wilder podcast. So as you will no doubt experience, we're going to talk a little bit about the project and what we've been up to. We will then interview a fantastic guest, and we've had some absolute cracking guests over the last 18 months on the podcast, covering everything from large-scale landscape recovery projects through to microgreen startups and everything in between.
The reason why we chose to document this journey is because we really started with our baseline was pretty low, extremely low, in fact. And so we felt that if we had thought it was important to move from our careers into making sure that what we were doing was putting back into the earth and not extracting from it, and we wanted to educate ourselves as to why it's important and speak to some amazing people, we thought other people might as well. So that's kind of why we've chosen to document this journey. So welcome and thank you for joining us on this adventure. So the big announcement before we get into the conversation with Si is that our 2 tiny homes, the 2 wagons or whatever you want to call them, that are situated in beautiful remote spots on the Grange project where we are on this rewilding project, are open for booking for 2025.
We're so excited to welcome people here, and we'll love to share a little bit more about why we think these cabins are particularly special at the end of the episode.
I think by the time you get to the end of Simon's chat, you'll probably understand why they're so special. But links will be in the show notes if you're interested and are inspired off the back of what Simon says to come have a look at all of his hard work and the beautiful nature that is all around us here in Monmouthshire. So without further ado, let's get into the conversation with Simon. It's a tale of 2 halves, this chat. So the first half is kind of practical. It's like, what are the steps in order to build something special, build your own off-grid cabin? And Simon goes through his approach and some of the materials and why he uses it. And the second half, which genuinely, as I say during the chat, felt like a therapy session. This man has this aura around him. He's a guru. And so when he starts speaking about the philosophical reasons why you might want to be off-grid and the benefits to you, you really prick up your ears and listen. And that's the kind of second half of the chat.
I'm genuinely considering moving into one of our cabins and letting go of our farmhouse.
Yeah, well, cheaper to run, if that helps.
Absolutely.
Right, here he is. Si, welcome to the Wilder podcast.
Thank you very much, Tom.
This episode has been long in coming. We are recording this before Christmas, but I think we're going to be releasing it some beginning of the year, where we can hit the ground running with this conversation. Before we get into the crux of the chat, would you mind giving us a bit about your background and what exactly qualifies you to be talking about the concept of sustainable homes, tiny living, or alternative living, whatever you want to call it?
Well, thank you, Tom. I I'm really pleased to be here, first of all, and it has been a long time in the running, and we have done lots of tiny home activities in practical reality, which we're going to hark to in our conversation. But yeah, to answer your question, I am at a place and time in my life where I have voluntarily lived off-grid, mostly on wheels in a tiny home, for my whole adult life. I now have a family and teach people to start on their own paths and journeys of living off-grid or living tiny in relation to tiny homes, which are, to give you a quick run through, off-grid timber cabins on wheels.
They're far more than that, but that is definitely an overview of what they are.
Yes. Yeah. So I started my journey by being inspired by people who were free, who lived on wheels and lived in an alternative manner. And I think probably having a lack of appeal in conventional living led me to a position of looking for an alternative possibility of living successfully with more connection to the land and the environment around me. Living on wheels seemed like a good way to have a low impact, a movable home which could be taken where my energy could be used to have positive effect on the land around me in a number of places. And I also came from a background of not having any assets. I didn't have a home or enough money to buy any land. And so I really had to build a home that I could take with me when I needed to go somewhere else. And tiny homes was a great solution. I lived in a double-decker bus for my first home.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I was going to if you didn't.
Yes. And over the years of living in a cold and quite miserable space, I devised how to make a lovely home inside the double-decker bus. And over the years, I, like the Fourth Bridge, learned more, did more building, and went back to start again. So over the years, I suppose I had the experience of improving my skills, my usage of the space, and going back and redesigning and starting again. And that led to me basically being on a path of experience, putting me in a position to be able to help others. So that's my personal journey to living in a tiny manner. The other, I suppose, aspect of living tiny for me personally was that I wanted to have a clean lifestyle. And by clean, I mean of minimal impact on the environment, of taking part positively with my resources and any waste that I created, and being able to live in a relatively frugal but comfortable modern world manner without the attachments of, a mortgage, financial constraints, and things that would impede on my own personal choices.
Yeah, and if anyone meets Si face to face, ask him about the story about the police officer and the double-decker bus. That's another conversation.
Another day.
So we met actually, semi by chance, wasn't it? We were looking for a tiny home solution for people to come and visit the project on, and there's an amazing college nearby called the Black Mountain College, or university as it is becoming. They were advertising your course, and Chloe's like, go for it, Tom. It was a day course to go and look at how to build your own tiny cabins. Now, I mean, I love how optimistic you are, Chloe, with sending me to go and do this, because the level of practicality I have is pretty negligible. But anyway, I went with all enthusiasm, and what was wonderful about you and your approach is that how instantly welcoming and open your course made people feel, even though I didn't have any, background in building at all, and also how accessible the steps were. It was just a day, and you laid it out really beautifully. You really shared as much information as you possibly could during that day. And I finished the day being very impressed by what you do and how you do it, but also with a significantly higher level of confidence that if I had to, I could go away and start the process of building my own tiny home. Now, we didn't do that, but mainly because we had guests coming to stay in our cabins, and I don't think they wanted a Tom V1 cabin to stay in. I think they wanted a properly built one, and that's when we had a chat and we thought, well, hey, can we do it together? And with you doing majority of all the skilled labor, and we've got there. But I was wondering if possible, could you give like an overview of just the processes involved in building a tiny home, and maybe like we covered on that course?
I think we've both come a long way since your day on the course,
Yeah.
and I'm glad you enjoyed it so much. The whole ideology of the course, behind the course, is that we all, as human beings, have the desire and the capability to build shelter for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
We may not have the experience in our modern world. It doesn't mean that we can't do it. And my interaction with people, really, especially through the course, is to highlight the fact that we can all actually do things. So, yeah, that's as a starting point. The main processes of designing and building a tiny home or a small shelter start with the purpose. What is it going to be for?
Mm-hmm.
Is it going to be for living in, for example? Is it going to be for full-time, a whole family to live in? Is it going to be for a single person to be living in a mobile state in a number of places? Or is it going to be a retreat, somewhere that has the assets to be able to be lived in, but isn't necessarily a full-time residence? So firstly, thinking about what the actual building is going to be used for. Secondly, about where it may well be used and what assets the local area may well have in terms of water supply, access to resources like wood for wood burners, for fuel, space to have an eco-loo, compost loo, direct sunlight, for example, for solar panels. And so really that's second element is about setting. The third element then is to take the need, purpose, and the assets of the setting and work out what you need to provide within a building to fit the purpose. It may be something that's totally simple to understand. A bedroom, a kitchen, and a warm space may be the solutions that you need to provide in a building. And really those three elements then should define what it is that that building contains. In a straightforward manner, it may be, just to give a quick example, that you need a home to be relatively self-sufficient, that it needs to support a couple and have enough space for a couple to live, and that there needs to be sleeping space, living space, cooking space, and access to the outdoors. So those things really precede the design, or precede what I would recommend to influence a design. I then usually, personally looking for a lower impact manner of building than conventional building, would be looking for some materials that already exist. Call them reclaimed or secondhand or used materials. Low impact is a great coverage for stuff that already exists that we can repurpose. The pieces that I would usually use in this particular moment are a trailer. I'm personally not very good at making trailers. There are lots that exist that are perfectly suitable for building a tiny house on. So I would use a second-hand trailer, which then gives me the foundation, a flat level surface to build the building from. That is totally mobile, defines the space on which the building is to be built. And a couple of other bits that I definitely recommend going for are windows and doors. Same as the trailer, it would be very difficult for me, possible, but difficult for me to build really sound windows and doors from scratch in a reasonable amount of time. And lots of these things are available secondhand, and they would save a lot of time in the building process, a lot of money and a lot of energy. Yeah, very importantly. Insulation is a thing that I will put into this category. A good low energy efficient insulation that can be repurposed. So essentially then you have your layout of a basic design for the purpose that you need the tiny home for. And you have a few of your ingredients, and I'm going to relate this in terms of building for a recipe sense, that you have your foundation, you have a few of your main core ingredients, and then essentially I would design my cabin, my tiny home, around those base ingredients. And so the cabin would evolve using timber, and I really like using timber from a couple of relatively local sources that have special uses, which we'll get onto later. But the timber is quite malleable, and you can do all sorts of things in terms of the actual building. And so the building made from timber would be created around those other elements and fitted out for purpose.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the work we've done together on the cabins, tiny homes, whatever you want to call them. It is fascinating when you've got the items or the recipe because you are constrained and you can work out what meal you want to cook. And then you really have to consider the purpose of every single item within that, minimizing things that are essential and required for the purpose of what we want to do. And as I look around us now in the room that we're in, I see a bookshelf, very pretty bookshelf, Chloe, but one with hundreds of books on and assorted knickknacks of our life. And it just makes me wonder, does it clutter our minds or does it help our brains? Come on, psychologist.
Step away from the books. I appreciate that I do have a lot of books, but I think the test is whether they bring you joy. And I would say, having read every single one of those books, that they have all brought me joy in one way or another.
Brought you joy. But anyway, let's move on.
They might bring other people joy that want to come and peruse our bookshelf and pick them to. I like lending books too. So it's all part of a connection and value-driven experience. Anyway, I digress. As I was speaking, I was thinking about our experience of living in our own version of our tiny home, which was the mobile home or log cabin that we lived in when we were building our last house. And there was absolutely joy in the simplicity of that way of living. By having less stuff around you, by having less space, it almost created more opportunity for creativity and time for sure, because there was less cleaning, less things to maintain.
Fewer things to go wrong.
Yeah, just less things to worry about. And the other bonus was it was an entirely timber-built cabin, which had its own beauty. And I really enjoyed being surrounded by those natural materials. Connected to the subject of natural materials, where do you source your timber and what characteristics are you looking for?
That's a really interesting question because timber itself, being a natural material, comes from nature, which provides us with an abundance of materials to use. But personally, I like to source my timber from the local area, therefore supporting local economy and people, business and nature, and keeping the impact of my choice of use of that particular resource to a minimum. I think that choosing to use timber, firstly, comes from a point of view of wanting to minimize the impact on the environment around me in one sense, and in the other sense that I am voting to use a natural material to create a better sense of well-being in the space, in this case obviously the tiny home, but in the space by giving an area which is created from natural materials, which can increase a person's sense of well-being in comparison to being in a conventional home with a big flat square white walls around them. Being in a space where you can see the grain of the timber, it provokes thought, it puts you at ease, it creates fascinating character through its colour and texture, and it's a pleasure to be around. Going back to the sourcing of the timber, I generally use timber from a couple of local woodsmen. And over the years, I've been very lucky to meet some people who are very keen on taking part in the cycle of abundance using timber. And there is a whole cycle of life that's in a woodland. It's a long and slow cycle of which we can benefit from extracting resources in a sustainable way. And so a woodsman is somebody who manages the woods. They manage the ecosystem in the woods and they harvest timber from it. And as part of a planting, natural regeneration scheme, an excess of timber is produced. And I've been very lucky to have timber from a couple of local woodsmen who I love to support. I've been to the woods with them, seen the places that the trees come from, and know that when the trees are harvested, for example, they create beautiful light spaces in the woodlands that regenerate naturally and are very abundant, bring nature into the spaces where essentially the humans have harvested something for their resources. And that goes hand in hand also with intentional replanting. So there is a restocking. It's not just that we are harvesting for our own aims, but actually it's part of a cycle of replenishment. And the timber is lovely. The timber usually comes from literally a chap with a tractor and a chainsaw who's in the woodlands harvesting a tree, and then he mills using a sawmill. So essentially it's a machine that cuts the timber up into slices and slabs and produces the most lovely timber to work with. My personal favourite, which I'd like to tell you about, is Western red cedar. Western red cedar is a beautiful softwood tree with so many benefits. The timber's lovely to work with. It has a beautiful golden hue to it. As it ages, as it's weathered and it ages, it kind of silvers with age. And in its older age, it becomes very seasoned and very beautiful and has a very elegant feel to it. But basically, it starts off with being a very malleable material. It's very lightweight, so it's great for tiny homes. It's very pliable in carpentry terms and pretty easy to use. And I love using this sort of timber because it's very easy to work with. And so you can create all sorts of things, whether it be the actual building or furniture within the space from the same material. And because it's so simple and straightforward to use in terms of its grain and texture and hardness, as well as being strong, you can chop and change. So if you change your mind about how you want your layout of your house, it's very easy to change or add something on using timber, but specifically with the Western red cedar. It also, amazingly, has a natural resistance to pests and disease. For example, it repels clothing moth. And so within the space, you have a natural resistance for your material, which I think is a lovely benefit. Also, it doesn't really need treating. And so you don't need to varnish or oil or treat. And that avoids a whole cycle, which I think that we, as modern humans, get intoxicated by, which is, recoating a surface, repainting our room, revarnishing a piece of timber. It's totally unnecessary because the wood's natural oils have a very preserving element to them. And actually, some of the original settlers' cabins in Western America were made from Western red cedar, and the cabins that last complete are still structurally sound, and the timber is untreated. And so the proof is in the pudding, really.
I love that sense of a shared ethos throughout the supply process, and it almost feels like the wood's being curated on its journey from tree to cabin, and you can kind of feel the people that have been involved in those steps of the journey, which I love that idea of the relationships that come with the wood and with the people on the journey. I suppose from a practical level, the two things that would concern me about tiny living would be, first of all, where am I going to get my energy source? If I need light in the evenings, where is that going to come from? And secondly, how we're going to manage the waste would be the two things that would concern me. So I wonder whether you might be able to speak to that a bit.
And just to add another layer to that is insulation. How do we keep it warm? And obviously not detailed, but I know you've got your own methods of doing that, so it's worth touching on that.
Firstly, I'm going to relate very quickly back to you saying how nice it feels to understand in the journey of timber, all the way from source to usage, because you are instilling that usage on a daily basis within your tiny home. This thread can run through every element of our lives. And this particular thread of sourcing something for its best purpose, for its lowest impact, and for its most positive use and effect on our daily lives and the environment in the future, is something that permeates tiny living entirely, as far as I can see, and that choices are evident across all walks of our lives.
Yeah.
Modern conventional living, modern conventional building generally avoids choice that is based on anything other than cost. And so I suppose my proposal with tiny living is challenging people to make choices for the most positive reason, from source to purpose, with every element and every aspect of not just the practical building, but the use and purpose for it in the future.
Uh-huh.
And now, taking that as our underlying thread, if you can kind of picture a web below all of our choices, in which we are taking responsibility for the impact that we have and making the most positive effect for the future, I'd like to address those questions that you put to me. So, Tom, I'm going to go for yours first. Insulation, because actually the insulation is an intrinsic part of the building, and it can be incredibly energy efficient if built well, but it can have a devastating effect on the environment if chosen badly.
Yeah.
And there are lots of natural choices of material for insulation. These range from hemp to cork, which usually comes in a rubble substrate, and wool, sheep's wool, all of which are good, viable options for a sound, natural insulation. And there are synthetic materials that are available. Solid board insulation, which is pretty conventional in modern buildings. There's stuff called space blanket, which is a bit like marathon runners' silver blankets in many layers with different foams in between, which is a small amount of material to the quality of insulation that it provides, but synthetic materials nonetheless. But basically the idea with the insulation in a tiny home is that the tiny home is, in my building, is quite a substantial timber cabin in terms of a traditional timber cabin. You know, it's a substantial timber structure with a cavity inside the walls to be filled with insulation. And if the entire structure of the building is insulated all of the way around and the windows are, at least double glazed, then the space inside will be really well insulated. It will be sound, it will be cool in the summer and warm in the winter when you have a heat source. It has a really good balanced environment within it. And obviously living in the modern world, it's infinitely preferable to be living in a highly efficient insulated space. So number one, on a practical level, the whole space needs to be insulated. Floor, ceiling, walls, really good windows, etc. And number two is the choice of insulation. I know that you're really interested in my personal choices here. I actually haven't used a natural material in the last couple of builds of tiny homes that I have done. I have chosen to use what I deem as a lower impact manner of using a highly energy efficient synthetic material. And so I've chosen to use offcuts from the factory of modern insulation boarding. Because I know that the efficiency built into the building will be extremely high and the materials would have been put into landfill, so I have saved them from wasting in the environment.
Which is what we've used for cabins here,
Yeah. And so there are lots of choices available. Some are more expensive than the others. Natural materials are very expensive and some of them are really renewable. Some of them are used from waste materials. But in terms of being an ethical choice, they are at the high end of the list. In terms of a practical choice, some of them aren't yet at the standard for being in a mobile building that would stand up to the test of time. But I think each individual building and each person's access to materials should influence their choices. Chloe, coming on to your question about energy, I do love to live in the modern world as well, even though I love being in my wagon in my tiny home with the wood burner on when it's snowing outside, as I was yesterday. I actually want to be at my desk with my laptop doing my work with the music on in light. And so I don't believe that there are any issues now in our production of off-grid kit that prevents us from living a modern life off-grid. My personal favourite is a solar off-grid system. Now, 20 years ago, there were very basic systems available and they weren't particularly efficient. And now there are the most incredibly efficient systems where you could live with all of your modern standard household domestic kit from a totally green source with some solar panels on the roof and a bank of batteries and a little bit of electrical kit to run the system. My own system actually is similar to what I've just described, but is made out of all second-hand bits and pieces, old solar panels that came off a school when they were upgrading them, and a battery bank that came from a forklift truck when it was being upgraded. And even the cables actually were reclaimed for my system. And I built it probably about 5 or 6 years ago. And I've had 2 days without power over that time. And I certainly haven't been particularly conservative with my usage. Once investing in the kit, I've been off-grid without paying anything else entirely. Although I've had a couple of issues, and those have been at the winter solstice, during a foggy week with the most minimal amount of sunshine. Over the last couple of years, I think that probably works out to being a lot more than if I was on grid, having maintenance from the grid every year or two. So I believe that there are lots of ways of doing it. Solar is my personal favourite, and in my own personal experience is highly successful. And heating, how to keep the space warm, So we touched on insulation before. Number one is have an insulated space. Absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt, the best way of creating a space that can be efficiently heated. You know, I speak from personal experience again. I have a wood burner. So the wood burner may be deemed as a way that isn't particularly sound because it puts out smoke from energy conversion. I live in a rural area and I benefit from the fact that the resource that I personally collect to burn in my wood burner to produce heat, to keep me warm, is there and is available to me and can be taken from the source where it's wastage. And therefore, I have a direct line to the source. I am personally responsible for creating my own resource. And I am personally responsible for the work and effort that goes into harvesting bits of timber, making logs, stacking and drying logs, collecting them and burning them in the burner, clearing the ash out afterwards, which I use as a fertilizer around the fruit trees. So this entire process comes back to me making a choice to be in touch with the resources that I am choosing to use to heat my space. Not only am I heating my little space, and it's lovely sitting in front of the wood burner with my feet up in the evening, you know, with my kettle on top of the burner, or using it to cook when it's on over the winter, but I am choosing to make a practical difference, to create my own resources, to be responsible for my own consumption, in comparison to handing my reliance over to the grid, using oil, using a hydrocarbon, using electricity that has come through the grid system. So by making a choice, I am cutting out my reliance on those systems. I am cutting out my effect of using my personal effect of a reliance on those systems. And I'm making a significant difference, as far as I can see, to minimizing my impact. Also, there is a positive effect that comes from this process. I'm intrinsically connected to the amount of heat that I really want to produce for myself. I'm not just going to be sticking logs on the burner with sort of total abandon. I'm very cautious about what I use, how much I use, and whether I can save it or whether it has a better purpose elsewhere, because I'm putting the physical energy into doing the work. And that, I think, has a real knock-on effect in all walks of our lives, certainly in energy consumption.
The phrase that just came to my mind as you were speaking was this idea of really conscious living, the idea of consciousness at every stage of design, decision making, and that consciousness being informed by values and the complexity of our choices. But actually, if you're really conscious and attuned to how you want to show up in the world and what's important to you, then in some ways those decisions are easy because the choices are clear if you want to live in a way that's coherent with that value set.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting way to describe it, being conscious, because I think I've benefited from so many years of experience of doing this, that actually the consciousness is an intrinsic influence at the beginning of our choices. Let me explain myself. If we are to make a choice to have a lower impact on our environment and to create some of our own resources, to be self-reliant, and for our actions within our lives to have a beneficial effect on the environment around us, then we have to make conscious decisions of how not to do things. Now, this for me originally was a very challenging proposition. Being a positive person, I wanted to make a positive action, a positive choice. I wanted to say yes to things and do things because, I was into it and I was excited about it. And there was a realization for me that I would like to share in this place. And that is, you really have to say no to a huge amount of our choices in the modern world to be able to make a positive difference. So much is available to us, which has a negative effect on our environment, that we have to have a starting point of saying no to allow the space to say yes to something more positive to be evident. So choosing to have a lower impact on our environment, choosing to have a more conscious pathway of being in touch with our resources is a starting point. But it's not until the process is underway, until we are actually taking action on those choices, that we will genuinely have the benefit, we will have positive effects on our environment.
And another question I've written down, which actually speaks to what you've just said there, is about what gives us the courage to make some of those, what could be perceived to be unconventional or uncomfortable choices when maybe there's so many easier choices that you could make because of how society has been constructed around us.
So good that you mentioned that, because society has been constructed to give us easier choices that have already been made on our behalf. It is more comfortable to sit here on our phones and spend the evening with the central heating on, just entertaining ourselves on social media. It is easier to buy into conventional housing and be connected to the grid because the supply is there and all we have to do is go to work and earn the money to pay for it. And so it is an uncomfortable proposition to step outside of the conventional mold. It is an uncomfortable and a difficult place to be able to choose to be different. Mm-hmm. And I think the courage to be able to do that should come from looking out at the world around us, looking at our human effect on the environment, and looking at potentially the notion that our modern civilization is having a negative effect on the environment in which we have to live, and it is unsustainable. And therefore, we have to make some choices that are going to be challenging, that are going to be difficult, that are going to be harder work and less comfortable to be able to start on a journey to make a difference. And I'm only talking about starting on the journey, because I believe that once you have made a transition in choices, the pathway actually is quite clear. It's not very hard to go and chop logs. Lots of people will spend money, which they have gone to work to earn, to go to a gym in a building with central heating on a machine that's run by electricity to stay fit for no purpose whatsoever other than to feel good and to be physically fit. And here is my alternative proposition. Go out into the fresh air, observe the trees in the hedgerows around you, meet your local landowners and get to know them. Harvest some of the leftover timber, which will have a beneficial effect on the environment and how it's being kept. Chop your own logs, get really fit and really skilled and really warm, building your own resources while becoming a specialist in different varieties of trees, timber and seasoning techniques so that you can load your own wood burner to cook your food from and enjoy being in a warm space, to have a really good effect of well-being. It's an alternative proposition to a conventional one, and it's hard to make that choice at the beginning. But once that becomes a process in reality, the benefits are unequaled.
Yeah. It's like a little therapy session speaking to you. I think this is great. Kind of taking one or two steps back there, but it was one of the things that was making me reflect on is with our kids is that, our local school got some great families around, and every time you meet up at the drop off or pick up, everyone's talking about where are you going on holiday? What's the next thing you're doing? What's the thing you're buying or whatever it is? And Chloe and I keep looking at each other going, we're not going anywhere on holiday. And it feels a bit uncomfortable because I don't think we've yet made that. We are on a journey to making the conscious decisions to say the future of what our decisions are going to be is going to be more on the conservative and looking at how best we engage nature, like you just described. But I think we haven't yet done the full switch where we've gone, this is our positive decision. We're just kind of toying with the idea.
But I think the point you made there, Si, about just starting is a really good one, because I think so many people, don't they, have a dream about living off grid, and it's understandable why. We've talked about a lot of the benefits of that experience, but I wonder how many people actually translate that into a reality, and whether that sometimes feels like a bit of an all or nothing proposition. But what are the steps along the way that can help you shift your sense of self, identity, have an experience where you get feedback from, connection with other people that live in that similar way or have similar value sets, and how that then enhances the courage required to make those decisions?
So we're coming to the end of the chat today. I think we promised a mini series, and this definitely should be a mini series because there's lots to cover and talk about those little steps before you take the leap. I'm thinking about starting to grow your own veg and just that self-reliance elements, or what you described, Si, about going out into the woods and just getting to know your trees, etc. I think would make a lot of sense. Now, I know there'll be a lot of people listening screaming out, yeah, but how do we afford this? What's the process about building my tiny home? And I know from a conversation we've had offline that you're really conscious of that, and obviously coming from the background that you have and having to build it all yourself. So I wonder if you could just wrap up with the logical stage you've got to now in how you help other people build their tiny homes.
Well, I think that The key for me is something that I kind of use as a personal ringtone, and that is you are starting your journey from scratch. If you're starting the journey, you've got to begin at the beginning. And that's the position that you're in now. It may be that your dream is to be living off-grid or growing your own vegetables or living in a low-impact way. And there is a journey from the position you're in to where it is that you presume your target is. And I say it's a journey because it's a movable journey to get towards your target. Now, my ringtone is starting, not aiming. So having an aim for a target is one thing, but actually starting on the journey means you are starting on the journey. You are on the journey. You have begun the process. And it is a journey that is changeable, in which you will have to maneuver. You will learn. You will have challenges to overcome, which eventually will become opportunities. And you will succeed because we have the capability as humans to do so. And in terms of starting this journey and starting with nothing, to answer your question, Tom, I know as a proven example myself that you can start with nothing. No money, no resources, no skills, and succeed along this journey. But I don't want to preach that, people should be copying me. Everybody is on their own journey and they are heading towards their own target. And I understand that it can be a difficult journey, but it is very much worthwhile. It's worthwhile for our children, for our families, for the future of our planet, genuinely, as well as our personal well-being and sense of accomplishment, and the positive day-to-day living that we get from living in this manner. And so, as myself within the Tiny Home Company, which is my commercial umbrella and name for helping people follow their journey to living tiny, I do a couple of things. I help teach through my courses to really inspire and inform people about starting their journey, to give them a starting point, to light the fire, to give them the ideas to follow the journey themselves. And if this starting point is too challenging from one aspect or other, and one aspect may be financial. And obviously, one of the things, that, as you can imagine, that I hear at the beginning of this journey from lots of people is, I need land. Where am I going to get the money from for land or a tiny home? Well, I've lived tiny for my whole adult life, and I don't own any land. And I have successfully managed to maneuver by starting with the home. So once having a tiny home, I actually had a physical thing that was a proposition to landowners to say, well, I'm me, this is my tiny home, and this is what I have to offer you in return for being able to live on your land. So actually starting on the journey to have the thing, to me, is the key. And it's not having the land. Having the money, however, to start from a conventional position, to be able to invest in a tiny home, and starting from scratch, it's not a cheap thing. Even if you scrape and scrounge around and have loads of reclaimed and recycled materials, it still is a substantial investment. I totally understand that. And my current challenge, which I'm hoping to offer as an opportunity to other people wishing to get onto the tiny house pathway, is to offer financing. Now, originally, I wouldn't have entertained offering financing because it would be totally against my morals and ethics. However, if somebody had said to me 20 years ago, hey, Si, instead of paying rent, you can pay to have your own tiny home. You can have it from the beginning and you can pay a rent. And by the time you've finished paying off, a bit like a hire purchase, by the time you have paid the whole amount for the value of the tiny home, it's yours. And it then becomes a capital asset, which I could have carried on living in forever, or I could have sold to put down as a deposit on a property. I would have jumped at the opportunity. And so this is something that I am now offering as part of my little portfolio of helping people on their tiny home journeys to help them get onto the ladder. And I don't necessarily mean the tiny home property ladder, although that is a possibility. It is getting onto the ladder to get to the place where these clear, conscious choices are endemic in their lives.
I think that will be very interesting to a lot of people. And there's also another wonderful story around, I think we were talking when we first met about you finding these landowners to put your tiny home on. And I said, well, don't the neighbours get upset? And what was great is hearing how, well, no, you integrate yourself with the community. You work out how you add value. And funnily enough, if you're adding value and you're an asset to the local area, then people love having you around. And I think that's a mindset change. It's how do we integrate ourselves with other communities, which is a whole new podcast that we should talk about. And you do more than just the tiny homes. You've got hydroponics. You do an amazing. You're not a chef, you're a cook. You create these experiences. You do a lot of stuff that, again, I think are part of these extended mini series. I hope if you have had fun,
Thank you. I know you'll definitely be back.
So the Tiny Home Company website will be in the show notes, and obviously there's Instagram accounts and social media again, which will all be in the show notes. And I'm sure if people want to learn more, are you happy for people to reach out on the website, etc.?
Absolutely. Get in touch with me on the website. Do have a nose and contact me. See what there is available. I have put up an array of past projects, but potential is everything. There is every possibility out there. And each individual tiny home is a fulfillment of somebody else's creation. Maybe that I am physically creating that for them, but it is fulfilling part of their journey, and that is totally available. Please get in touch.
Thank you again, Si, and hopefully see you soon.
Thank you very much.
So before we start pulling apart that conversation, and there's lots to discuss there, having listened back to the interview, I probably need to clarify some of the words that I said on it. And those words were around the school pick-up and drop-off point and our wonderful, amazing community of parents and friends that drop off their children there. I wasn't commenting on or putting any judgment on what other people were doing. What I was trying to point out was that our position was changing. Our thought process was changing in relation to that. And the fact that we hadn't yet 100% committed to the lifestyle of less is more, and yet we were having different kinds of thoughts. So that's what I was trying to get to, but I can understand why maybe it needs clarification.
The point Si made there about this sort of starting point of saying no, I think is a really interesting one, because we're surrounded by a society with all the kind of consumerist messages that is trying to encourage us to say yes all the time. Yes to new things, yes to new experiences, yes to these holidays, yes to new stuff, new cars, whatever. That's what capitalism is based on. So it's not really surprising that to step back and say, actually, I'm going to starting point to say no to anything that might involve more extraction from the earth or more energy to produce is quite an interesting shifting point, because then you really think about, okay, when I'm going to say yes, what are the reasons behind me saying yes? And what are the values that are driving that? Because it's not to say that we would never go on holiday again. It's just that when we go on holiday, we're going to really think about where we're going to go, the energy impact of us going, what are the reasons behind us going, and how we're going to use that budget, for want of a better word, in line with our value set.
Yeah, and it's letting go of those intrusive thoughts that are things like, are we boring? Why are we not going to do all these wonderful and weird and wonderful things? And actually, we just like being where we are.
Again, the dominant societal messages are perhaps that we need to go elsewhere to find fulfillment, and in taking the time to appreciate the simple things.
You're trying to call me simple?
No, I'm just saying, I jotted down some of the adjectives that Si used to talk about his tiny homes during the conversation, because they just really spoke to me. He talked about freedom, the connection to landscape, to the resources, to community, clean, low impact, simplicity. Those things all sound like things that I want to hold on to in my life.
And I'm sure I'm not the only one that got to the end of that interview with him and was like, I'm getting the thing and I'm driving somewhere and I'm getting off grid, because it just, I mean, at least to me and I think to us, just makes sense. We watched The Matrix recently, didn't we? About the blue pill and the red pill. It is terrifying. If you watch it now, despite being an amazing film, it is terrifying watching the parallels of what's happening. But I see the world now in terms of the awakening. Like, we've had our awakening, our environmental, our
polycrisis.
Yeah, whatever you want to call it, but we've had an awakening that's allowed us to reflect on our life and how we want to interact with it. And it feels really freeing once you get there, once you understand the science behind it. It's still hard because you're trying to swim against the tide, and invariably it takes energy to do that. But it also feels like you're doing the right thing. Do you have any other points you would like to reflect upon? I mean, there are plenty, I'm sure.
I think just a quick one, because I'm conscious it's quite a long interview already, and we do want to talk a little bit about our tiny homes here at the Change Project. But what I think I hadn't fully appreciated within the conversation with Simon is just how much emphasis that he and the tiny home company place on reclaimed materials. And why, we think about that in relation to clothes. That feels like quite a common thing now, pre-loved clothing and vintage, and that feels like moving into the mainstream.
Common, and I think that's a perspective thing. It's common within our circles, but I don't think that's a common thing writ large.
I mean, That's a very valid point. But I think if you look at the growth of something like Vinted, there must be some stats that say that it's becoming a more common occurrence for people to buy pre-loved online. I don't know.
Maybe. I couldn't debate this without the stats in front of me, Chloe.
But regardless, I think what's interesting about Simon is he's moved my thinking beyond, let's not just thinking about where you get your next jumper from, but actually thinking about the life cycle of things like buildings and the reclaimed potential there is for things like the offcuts of insulation and windows. Like I just genuinely hadn't thought that there'd be a source of reclaimed windows that you could put into these tiny cabins that would look just as good as brand new windows.
There's probably a business in that somewhere, isn't there? If you enjoyed that conversation and you would love to hear more from Simon, please feel free to reach out to us or Simon and let us know that you enjoyed it. Because I think if we get some really positive feedback from this, then we would 100% look to do some more mini-series with him and explore his brain in more depth and detail.
I think there are a lot of places we could go.
So if you've got this far, it's probably because you're listening intently to hear more about the cabins that we have, or the wagons, or the tiny homes that we have now situated across the site. So Chloe, would you mind first explaining why we've chosen to have cabins on site? Then we'll go on to talk about what they are and what's special about them. And we'll finish with when we'll start welcoming in guests and how they can book.
Lovely. I think for us, a big part of this project has always been around sharing our journey, sharing the experience of being part of wilder nature and the kind of education elements that come alongside that. So a logical next step was having people to come here and to be experienced being part of the project. And when I say being part of the project, that can mean appreciating the beauty of the wilder nature. The cabins are in these most amazing locations. They're completely isolated. You have either the option of being on the top of the hill where you have fantastic views out over the project as a whole through to the Monmouthshire Hills, or you're kind of tucked down, cuddled by the hill, again with this kind of sense of pure isolation. Or it could be getting involved in some of our citizen science activities, or it could be involved having a tour from us, or, whatever way you'd like to be part of the Grange project. This is an opportunity to come and stay with us and enjoy that experience.
Or just explore what it feels like to be in a tiny home. And from this whole conversation we just had. And it has been fun. And just to elaborate, every step of the way of these tiny homes, we tried to make sure everything was as reclaimed as it possibly can be, to show what can be achieved with being a bit sensible and applying Simon's techniques to it. So we really hope that this is a great example of what can be achieved. One of the things I do love, not only do we have the tiny homes, we've got these wooden decking that's connecting the tiny homes to kind of brings you out onto the project with a beautiful awning. So it's almost like a safari feel when you're sat up there. These minuscule, tiny, beautiful log burners that are handcrafted in the UK that are sitting there to keep you warm if required. But like I say, they're pretty damn well insulated. And from guests and friends we've had stay already, the comment on the bed that's in there, it's like lying on a cloud. And it's a small space, and when majority of the space is taken up with the bed, we felt that that was kind of quite an important experience.
And it is lovely to think about some of the feedback we have had from volunteers and people that have tested out the cabins, because the main complaint is the sound of the bird song is quite dominating in the morning, and the barn owls can be really quite noisy.
It's surprising that. And also the pigs will come by and give you a little wave as they go past as well. So you've got to be prepared for all of these wonderful occurrences when you're here.
And I think the icing on the cake is the Grange Hub, which is right at the heart of the project. And it's a lovely community space where you can have a wonderful shower, read books, play board games, help yourself to a drink. We really hope it'll be a facility that is enjoyed by all visitors to the project.
And when we say that we hope, it's because it's not finished yet. But it will be finished by the time you can book. I promise, probably.
So Tom, when can you book?
I don't know.
July.
From July. You can book from July. Please get there, get on the website, let us know if you have any issues, because it's the first time we've ever set up a booking system thing via the website. So any issues with that booking system, just let us know, send us an email, we'll get it sorted. But you can start booking up from July. We would love to welcome as many people as we possibly can. And it is important to note that a significant proportion of the fee, or the booking fee, will go towards the charitable work that we are going to do as well as part of this project. We want to make sure that everything we do is a circular economy and feeds into each other. And you guys coming to stay on this project not only helps increase your awareness of the importance of increasing biodiversity and spending time in wilder nature, but also will help funnel money into the charity, which then increases our reach to help school children and other organisations get involved in wilder nature. Right, now that was probably the most salesy we have been ever.
It's not in my comfort zone, I have to say.
But we're all passionate about it, so that's why we probably gone for a bit too long. But it's all good. Well, we hope you enjoyed this podcast episode. We really appreciate everybody and all the support, and every email we receive makes a big difference to our day. So thank you very much, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you, everybody.